Pope Benedict XVI is dead. An 800-year-old prophecy is set to be unleashed.
Is the prophecy true? The signs are literally all around us.
The prophecy foretells the coming of the final pope and the end of time.
The book of Daniel speaks of judgment coming on the earth, a resurrection of the dead. No flesh will be saved.
He who takes the holy crown after Benedict shall be named Petrus Romanus.
He will actually be the false prophet of biblical fame that helps give rise to the Antichrist.
Written over 800 years ago by an Irish monk named Malachi, the prophecy of the popes predicts the end of time. Could that end be upon us?
This is going to be a time of the greatest tribulation in world history. In fact, the Bible tells us that 1/3 of the earth's population will be destroyed.
According to Malachi's prophecy, Pope Benedict's death will trigger an Armageddon, as described in the books of Daniel and Revelation.
Around the world today, prophetic signs seem to be unfolding at breakneck pace.
The prophecy of the popes tells us that with the death of Pope Benedict XVI and the election of Petrus Romanus, Rome will burn.
Apocalyptic prophets like Malachi from the 10th century on are prophesying against Rome because of what they see as its opulence, its power, the arrogance and greed of the high churchmen.
Scholars call this period of time the pornocracy. It's characterized by corruption, all sorts of immoral activity. The papacy had degraded and became guilty of all sorts of unchristian types of things.
When apocalyptic prophets talk about Rome, they talk about punishment for what they perceive as wickedness here on earth. And they're not thinking about future punishment a long time from now. They're thinking about future punishment today or tomorrow. They see the apocalypse as something necessary.
An ancient prophecy exists that raises questions about the future of mankind.
Well, the prophecy of the popes is a list of 112 phrases. At first glance, some of them seem vague, but upon investigation, there seem to be some very compelling reasons to believe that this is a true prophecy.
Here we have a list written in Latin by a simple monk that accurately tracks the lines of popes from his time to ours over an 800-year period with what can only be described as miraculous precision.
Did God choose a simple Irish monk named Malachi to deliver his apocalyptic warnings to the world?
Malachi O'Morgare was a bishop in Armagh, which is now in Northern Ireland. And of course it was his dream, like it was many faithful in that day, to travel to Rome to meet the Pope.
Malachi leaves Ireland on June 12, 1139. His small party won't arrive in Rome until May of the following year. An epic journey across a dark and dangerous continent.
During the 1100s, the world was a brutal place. There were plagues, there was violence, so traveling from Ireland to Rome was an extremely dangerous journey.
Throughout the journey, Malachi claims to feel the presence of God guiding him and giving him strength. But when he at last reaches Rome, he is in for an unpleasant surprise.
Malachi has just completed this 11-month journey across Europe. He has seen the most heart-rending conditions, poverty immeasured. And now he arrives in Rome, and probably the last thing that he expects to see is the opulence that surrounds the Pope.
Malachi is furious. How could such extravagance exist in the church? How could Pope Innocent II allow such indulgence in his own house? Retreating to the hills overlooking the great city, Malachi is overcome with emotion.
Propter impietatum summorum pontificum, Roma mos excura.
Nobody knows for sure what happened to St. Malachi, but something did happen because he began to write a series of 112 Latin verses or mottos, each of them describing every pope that would exist, from Pope Innocent II to the final pope.
And so, in anger and disgust, this simple monk creates the prophecy of the popes. The document also spells out what will happen once the list of popes comes to an end. The destruction of Rome.
About 3 years after Malachi returned to Ireland, Pope Innocent, whom he had met with, died in 1143. And the pope that replaced him was known as Celestine II, whose family had a castle in Umbria on the banks of the Tiber. Why that's interesting is because in the prophecy of the popes, it said that this numbered pope would come from a castle on the Tiber.
We can really just look to the last 4 popes and see some astonishing examples of accuracy. Paul VI, his motto was flower of flowers. His coat of arms features 3 flowers, the symbol of the French monarchy. John Paul I, from the midst of the moon. He was born in the diocese of Belluno, which means beautiful moon, and he ascended to the papacy during a half moon and then died 1 lunar cycle later. John Paul II, from the labor of the sun. Not only was he born during a solar eclipse, he was buried during a solar eclipse. The motto for our current pope was from the glory of the olive. Many Catholic scholars were expecting a pope to come from the Benedictine order, symbolized by an olive branch. Cardinal Ratzinger, who was not a Benedictine, was elected pope. But then, to the astonishment of everyone, he picked his papal name as Benedict.
According to Malachi's prophecy, Pope Benedict's death will trigger an Armageddon, as described in the books of Daniel and Revelation. 800 years ago, in the hills above Rome, an Irish monk named Malachi writes a prophecy that traces a path to a catastrophic end of existence. If the prophecy is true, all it will take is the death of Pope Benedict and the election of Petrus Romanus as Pope to bring our way of life tumbling down.
Is the prophecy true? There's 800 years of evidence that these predictions are tracking towards an accurate moment in time.
Despite centuries of hard work from the Enlightenment through the detailed, careful science of the 19th and 20th centuries to explain natural phenomena such as earthquakes, plagues, tsunamis, you name it, some people still choose to believe that these things are not the result of natural mechanisms, but are the result of God's wrath being visited on a sinful and wicked world.
According to the prophecy, there will be no answer that man can come up with that's going to stop the spread of this end times plague. Think what you will, be as skeptical as you like, but the time of great tribulation is already at hand. In the next few years, maybe even months.
Malachi's prophecy of the popes and the destruction of Rome it envisions will be proven or disproven very soon. For some, the end truly is near.
If Pope Benedict dies or is somehow otherwise replaced by Petrus Romanus, the end is here and there's nothing anybody can do about it.
Well, it's interesting because, you know, one of the great ironies when Cardinal Bergoglio was elected and took as his namesake the name Francis, from Francis of Assisi. We just thought that was such a great irony because Francis of Assisi prophesied about the final pope, and he said he would be a deceiver who would lead the church astray, ultimately leading to the destruction of Rome. Well, that's actually part of the prophecy of the popes, that the city of Rome is going to be destroyed. And this pope has made reference to it. His own personal pastor, as they call it, Archbishop Gonsuin, actually did an interview with the largest two Catholic broadcast networks in the world, EWTN, and I forget what the name of the other one was. And they asked the question, is this the final pope from the prophecy of the popes, from Malachi's prophecy?
Wow.
And his own personal pastor, Pope Benedict, and Francis agreed that he indeed might be that man. And then from that point forward, he seems to literally just be following a roadmap. I mean, you asked me back in the green room, is America turning towards socialism? Well, right now we have a pope whose background is Marxism, socialism. And by the way, I think he might even play a role in this building of the third temple. Look at what he just did in the last week when he went and met with the Moroccan king, right? Mohammed VI. And they signed a statement, a declaration, saying that Jerusalem is a city for all of the Abrahamic faiths, Muslims, Jews, and Christians, except when they referred to Jerusalem, they excluded the Jewish name, the Judaic name, Yerushalayim, I think that's the way you say it. They only called it by its Arabic or Muslim name and the English name, which sent this message that, yeah, okay, you're there, but we don't really see this being the city, the future of this city for the Jews. And then, I mean, this had some of the conservative Catholic leadership in a meltdown. He then ordered Catholics in that Muslim country not to preach the gospel, not to share Christ with the Muslims, not to try to convert them to Christianity. And now you've got guys that are, the former defender of the faith for the Vatican. And he's literally using terminology in which he's referring to Pope Francis as the false prophet and Antichrist, and he's not alone in that. So maybe Francis of Assisi was correct, and the guy who took his name is playing a role that is tied to prophecy. But now that they're speaking about Jerusalem and who really has rights to Jerusalem, when you talk about who has the right to Jerusalem, you're also talking about the Temple Mount as it relates to these Muslim, to the faith, because that's where the compound is, the Al-Aqsa Mosque, the Dome of the Rock. That's basically the center of their spiritual influence in Jerusalem.
He said there were going to be 112 future popes. And the number 112th Pope was going to be the last Pope. And the question is, Pope Francis, currently the Pope, what number is he? He's number 112. He has been the 112th Pope since St. Malachi gave the prophecies, if in fact his prophecies are correct. And so let me just tell you why I believe that they very well could be correct. Now, the interesting thing about Pope Francis is he's 85 years old and he's not in good health. The latest picture I saw of him was he was in a wheelchair and he was talking about retiring. And Benedict, before Francis, was the first pope in 600 years to step down and to retire. He's still living at Vatican City. We were at the Vatican about 4 years ago, and he was there. He's still living there. And so let's just kind of give you some proof, some reasons that I believe that the prophecy of the popes is true. And the first is, what are the chances out of 112 popes that the final one would occur when all the other end time signs have been happening for 70 years? It's astronomical. In other words, and by the way, if Benedict would not have resigned, he'd still be pope. He's still alive. The popes don't retire. Popes die. They die in office. And so Benedict retired, giving Francis the opportunity to step in and be the 112th pope. And so Psalm 90 says the days of a man's life are 70 years. Or if by reason of strength, they're 80 years. We're 74 years in since Israel became a nation. And we have a pope who the St. Malachi prophecies are saying is the final pope, number 112, and he's 85 years old and not in great health. And so if the tribulation started today, and according to St. Malachi's prophecy, the final pope will lead the church or lead his flock, the Catholics, through the tribulation. He will lead his flock through many tribulations. I'll read you the exact prophecy here in just a minute. And so if the tribulation began today, okay, he would be 92 years old when it ended. So there's a clock ticking really hard on this thing, both the generation that we're living in and also on the final pope. And so we're living in a world where we're seeing all the end time signs coming true. And if they haven't come true, they're about to come true. They're happening right before our eyes. They're unfolding before our eyes. And we just happen to have the 112th pope in office right now. And so I'm saying that's one reason that I believe that it's true. Now, if he dies or if he retires, well, it's going to put that to bed real quick. If you have a 113th pope, well, that does away with all the conjecture right there. But for right now, we have number 112 in office. This book, Petrus Romanus, they talk about in the book, they document all the things that different popes that St. Malachi said about different popes. Let me read you just one of these. This is Pope Benedict XV. And from 1914 to 1922, he was the pope. And St. Malachi said of him, religion depopulated. Okay, so in other words, he didn't know his name, but he just described Pope Benedict as religion depopulated. Okay, well, was that true? Well, he was the pope during World War I, and during World War I, the Catholic Church was devastated as far as their members are concerned. But the Russian Orthodox Church lost 200 million members because of the Bolshevik Revolution, and some were killed and persecuted. So 200 million people left the Russian Orthodox Church because during the time of Pope Benedict XV, exactly what St. Malachi said would happen. And so Pope Benedict, by the way, the former Pope before Francis, his resignation was shocking because he was the first Pope in 600 years to resign. Of course, like I said before, he's still alive, but here's the interesting thing. Tom Horn saw in a vision, the Lord gave him a vision that Pope Benedict was going to resign in April of 2012. He said it publicly, that he was going to resign. Okay, well, it hadn't happened in 600 years, so it sounded kind of crazy. Well, so 2012 came and went, April 2012 came and went, and then the following year, in 2013, the Vatican announced that Pope Benedict was resigning. And then they gave an interview to the New York Times, and in the New York Times, they said he had actually resigned in April of 2012, and they were just now making it public. So why would the Lord show Tom Horn? Now, he's my friend, and you can see this on YouTube. Why would the Lord show Tom Horn that the Pope Benedict was going to resign? It's because I believe it validates, again, what they wrote in the book. I believe that this is the 112th Pope, and I believe that, many things are now let me say one thing. Anytime something is extra biblical, which means if I'm talking about Bible prophecy, something that's clearly in the Bible, I'm going to be very strong about it. I'm not strong about extra biblical stuff. And so I'm not saying, you have to believe this or else. I'm just saying it's another thing out there that gets me to believe that God is up to something and we're living in the end of the end times. The reference to St. Francis, let me just talk about him specifically. So here's what St. Malachi said about the 112th Pope. And this is right now Francis. This is a quote. In the final persecution of the Holy Roman Church, there will sit Peter the Roman, who will pasture his sheep in many tribulations. And when these things are finished, the city of 7 hills will be destroyed, and the dreadful judge will judge his people. The end. That's it. Of all of his cryptic phrases for 112 popes, that's what he wrote about Francis, 112th Pope. And so right now, he's saying that this Pope is going to lead his flock through many tribulations. And then the city of 7 hills will be destroyed. That's Rome. Rome is the city of 7 hills. Rome will be destroyed. Okay, and many people believe now that the Pope is the false prophet. Some people believe the Pope is the Antichrist. But they believe now that the Vatican City, Rome, will be a place of judgment when Jesus returns, judging the false prophet, the Antichrist, those kinds of things. So is it true? In other words, is it true that this is the 112th Pope and he's going to be, the false prophet and lead his flock through many tribulations? We'll see. Now, by the way, when it says Peter the Roman, in this Petrus Romanus means Peter the Roman, and St. Malachi used the name Peter the Roman. So is that his name? Well, Pope Francis' real name is Jorge Mario Bergoglio. And so, but why would he be called Peter the Roman? Well, remember, his name as a pope is St. Francis, or Pope Francis. And he gets that from St. Francis of Assisi. And St. Francis of Assisi's real name was Giovanni di Pietro, that's Peter, di Bernardone. That was his real name. He was Italian, he was Roman. His name can literally be translated Peter the Roman. So it's all these things are interesting, and so do I believe it's true? Based on what I know, I believe it's true. And again, I want to say it's extra biblical, so I'm not being dogmatic about it. But I believe it's very interesting that back in the 13th century, that we had a Archbishop of Ireland who was sickened as he went through Europe and saw the squalor and also the opulence of the Vatican. And if these things are true, the Lord gave him all of these pictures of 112 popes, and he sat and wrote it down with great accuracy in some cases, like I just showed you about the Pope during World War I. And now we have the 112th Pope sitting at the Vatican, old, and we'll see. And I believe, and I've said this before, I don't believe we're living in the end times. I believe we're living at the end of the end times. All these things are coming, to fruition at the same time. And I think it's just another reason to look up, because our redemption is drawing near. It's another reason for us to be careful in the way we're living our lives. Be careful to believe the Bible and to keep your eyes on Jesus and live your life in the right way. There are a lot of people mocking and scoffing and living like, there's nothing's going to happen. And the Bible prophecy isn't true. I believe every word of Bible prophecy is true. And we see all these things taking place like Jesus said they would. And very interestingly, we see the 112th Pope sitting in office right now.